Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the third Living with Wildfire webinar in the series. We're super excited to have you today. And we have two speakers from East Bay Regional Park District who are going to talk to us about fuels reduction in the parks and building wildfire resilience. The Living with Wildfire series, we are having local environmental and fire professionals come and share about fire history in the Bay Area, the unique qualities of the Bay Area and how that contributes to how we experience fire, and the ways that we can prepare for fire. So I'm Zoe Fung. I'm the Wildfire Conservation Coordinator with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. And I'm going to introduce my colleague, Joe Boyden. Joe, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for the great intro, Zoe. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Boyden, and I am a Climate Action Fellow working for the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. I'm really happy to be here today with you all, and special thanks to our speakers, Givonne Law and Allison Rofe, both from the East Bay Regional Park District. So without further ado, I'll flip it over to Givonne.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be speaking with you today about this awesome topic. Fuels management is the name of the game over here, where I work with the East Bay Regional Parks District Fire Department. I'm a fuels reduction coordinator and a registered forester with the state of California. So when it comes to vegetation management for fire risk reduction and forest health improvement and resiliency, that's the bread and butter for me. So I am here to talk today about let me just switch my screen over. Increasing resilience and decreasing fire risk with vegetation management tools. I want to dig into a number of the tools that we use over here in the park district. And we, in short, sort of use all of the tools. But to begin, hold on, sorry. All right. First, why are we using these tools? Like, what's wrong with the parks? What's wrong with our vegetated areas and our wildlands and our wildland urban interfaces in the first place? Why can't we just leave them the way they are? They're lovely. That goes into a number of different reasons. There's it's a really complicated answer to that sort of question. But the one that we're going to focus on today, the facet of that, is going to be fire and fire risk reduction. Because as I said, that's my specialty. First off, fire regimes. So a fire regime is a pattern of fire occurrence, including the frequency, intensity, and size. In between our historical fires and our current fires that we're having these days, there's a lot of differences that have come up. Historical fires were influenced by weather, but also by cultural burning. So that would be indigenous peoples purposely igniting fires to manage the land in very objective and purposeful ways. And climate, of course. Climate always has a major influence on fire and the fuel that fire is consuming. Generally, the historic fires were higher frequency and they had lower severity, but there were still occasional stand clearing events that would improve certain vegetation types and were really critical to maintaining those vegetation types or progressing them into more mature stages. Currently, fire is looking really different these days. We've all seen this, many of us in our lifetimes. There have been drastic changes in the last couple decades from the fires that we remember or fires that we've read about in, studying this industry and just hearing about it on the news. Current fires are influenced as well by climate and weather, just like before, but they're also heavily influenced by habitat conversion. Most of that habitat conversion is due to anthropogenic causes, such as fire suppression and introduction of invasive species and development, as well as anthropogenic fire ignitions. So similar to, the fires, well, not similar. Hold on, let me backtrack. The anthropogenic fire ignitions of today are not purposeful or objective in general. Compared to the historical fires. These days, anthropogenic fire ignitions are usually accidental and they're more prevalent in some areas than others. Some examples of common anthropogenic fire ignitions might be roadside fire starts, car goes on fire on the side of a road and sets the vegetation directly on that roadside on fire, and that fire then spreads into the vegetation. House fires, campfires that escape, someone throwing a cigarette out the car window, or arson. So there's a lot of different influences on current fires. Some of the big ones that are making fires so much more intense and severe and impactful compared to historic fires does really drive down into the climate, as well as habitat conversion. So those are the things that when we're speaking about our parks and how to control fire risk, how to increase resiliency, how to improve forest health, we're battling against. There's not a ton we can do in regards to climate change on a large scale. Obviously, we're trying to do it on a small scale, but large scale, we only have so many options. So we're tackling some of these other influences like habitat conversion, as well as reducing risk where we have our most likely concern of anthropogenic fire ignitions. And that brings me to my next slide here. So you might be looking at this and thinking about historic fires, thinking about current fires and say like, okay, so why can't we just, do some controlled burning and, let fires take over and do their thing? There's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't be the best answer for us. And a lot of them are very obvious. One of that, of course, is risk. We have development and people and resources, historical, prehistorical, biological, that we need to protect from fire. And so when we do fire, it needs to be in a very controlled fashion. There's also, of course, the regulatory concerns. One of the major ones that are people are trying to figure out how to handle, how to introduce fire back into the environment is regulation and smoke management plans. Smoke management and smoke concerns are a very real and necessary concern that needs to be managed when talking about having more fire on the landscape. And we're still kind of trying to figure that out and how to regulate it. Funding is also another reason why fire can't be the only answer. Prescribed fire and controlled burns and beneficial fire are less expensive than other options of vegetation management, but they are not free. They're still very expensive. They're still very resource heavy operations to run them correctly. So there's that to consider as well. That brings into the equation all the other things that we do to get fire back on the landscape and help control fire risk and increase resiliency and forest health or vegetation, landscape health. Wildfire resilience and these practices are done with general types of fuels management and various tools. They can be manual, they can be mechanical, chemical, as an herbicide, grazing, or burning. With the East Bay Regional Park District's fire department, we have our fuels reduction program. It's a very forester veg management driven funding driven program with CEQA coverage and NEPA coverage. It was it was driven by the Oakland Hills fire in 1991. Which marked a change of priorities for the park district in regards to fuels management, leading to funding for first the plan and then the regulatory coverage. And that plan allows us to utilize all of these tools in various capacities in the priority areas that are outlined in the plan. Those areas are called recommended treatment areas. I'll get into that in just a little bit. Here we go. I'll get into that now. Did I skip a slide? No, sorry. Fuels reduction in priority areas. Our fuels reduction priority areas are called recommended treatment areas. They are located throughout the East Bay Hills from Point Pinole down to Lake Chabot, and they prioritize areas that are within the wildland urban interface, roadsides, or areas of vegetation where embercast is a high concern for those areas. There's also a number of recommended treatment areas that are in place to protect biological or historical or prehistorical resources. But for the most part, they're within the WUI. And those areas, like the one that you see here outlined in pink, are to control the vegetation and allow for vegetation management directly where fire ignitions are most likely. Or again, for protection of life and structures or habitat. RTAs were selected using fire behavior studies that modeled fuel types. For a little bit of history on that. There's also a FEMA biological opinion attached to the permitting that allows for work around species that are listed as endangered or threatened. And in 2020, this plan was greatly expanded, again, with utilizing many of the same tools with the CalVTP programmatic EIR, where the park district did their own project-specific analysis and pretty much almost doubled the area for permitted work. There we go. All right. So with all of that, how is the East Bay Regional Parks managing fuels? Allison's going to get into the grazing portion, or at least the cattle grazing portion, in just a little bit. I'll cover the other portion of the grazing. But along with that, we're doing a lot of manual work, mechanical vegetation management. There's chemicals that are used where they're needed and with caution. Grazing, yeah, everything Allison's going to go over with all sorts of different grazing stock and the goats. And then burning, pile burning, broadcast burning are all used for vegetation management around the parks, and they're used in conjunction with each other. They're used, with prescriptions, and they're used in coordination with the other departments of the park district. To go into a little bit of detail on that, manual and mechanical vegetation management is often used in art treatments for initial treatment and again for re-entry work. Let me get back to my notes over here. Sorry, so I don't miss anything. These types of management are used to prepare an area for lower impact maintenance practices like grazing and burning. And it can involve small hand tools, small mechanical equipment, or large mechanical equipment. It can, manual management, it can involve pruning, for instance, ladder fuel reduction, the fuels that climb up from the ground up into the canopies of trees and can pull fuel or fire rather from the ground up into the canopy. Cutting or removal of trees and shrubs and grasses by hand or using handheld equipment. There can be bark pulling, removing dead or down wood and litter, mulching, establishing new fire-resistant or low-risk plant habitats, and erosion control. The mechanical management can also, be a really large factor, and is a lot of what the fuels reduction coordinators oversee, utilizing working with either our internal fuels crew or Conservation Corps, Conservation Corps agencies or contractors. And that can include anything from like cutting grasses and removing weeds, shrubs, and trees, or it could include operations like grading, mowing, mulching, chipping, mastication, crushing. And the contractor work is usually using very large equipment such as feller bunchers, cut-to-length harvesters, forwarders. That can be to fell larger trees, establish landings, create skid trails, or yard material out and deal with the biomass that's generated from these projects. So as you can see, just these two tools alone create a lot of utility and getting a lot of vegetation management done. And that's all done generally it's some of the highest impact practices that we are out doing in regards to impact to the public, impact to the habitat, impact to aesthetics, noise, goes on and on. And so we're out there doing this work with the intent long term of getting to less impactful practices, to initially treat these areas, really hit the fuels hazard risk and the forest health head on in order to get to something more like grazing or burning, or some of the less impactful manual treatments, I should say. So that takes me now to good fire and happy grazers. This is all fun stuff. A lot of people see the manual work and mechanical work, and it doesn't bring a smile to their face unless they particularly hate that specific piece of vegetation that we're trying to manage. But most people love the goats. And while fire is, some people see it as a positive, some people see it as a negative. With a little bit of discussion, a lot of people, see it as the great vegetation management tool that it is. Burning and grazing in the East Bay parks are usually used as fuels management maintenance tools, like I was saying. Pile burning, which is what you can see in that picture up at the top on I think that'd be on the left-hand side of your screen. Can be done at large scale, as in like hundreds of piles at a time, or small scales where you just have like 2 or 3 or even just one pile in conditions that minimize impact and reduce risk. And that's usually smaller debris that's piled up in a pretty structured manner so that the fuel consumption is happening at a higher temperature, and the impacts such as smoke are reduced because of the way they're structured and the conditions in which they are burnt. There's also broadcast burning. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of prescribed fire. That's where you have like a whole field or a whole large area that you use different firing techniques to set alight and achieve generally objectives that are lined out in an instant action plan and in the burn plan to just meet your objectives of your prescription for vegetation management. Broadcast burning can be cooperative events, really important thing. All of these management practices, I should say, can be done as cooperative events and should be taking into account community interests, including those of Indigenous people that are in the area and have expertise in how to manage these areas. Broadcast burning is probably the poster child of seeing those sorts of cooperation, those sort of communications occurring, and that is an important part of having good fire out there is making sure that that cooperation is happening and that expertise is being accounted for and taken into consideration in developing those objectives and making sure that these practices are being done to the best standard. The overall practices, good fire, and all of this returns the landscape to a desired state. Broadcast burning, as I said again, is just kind of like the poster child of one of the ways to do that. And of course, then there's grazing, which I won't go into too much detail on again. But yeah, grazing is a fire adjacent practice that can manage fuels where fire cannot be used. It also is often used in conjunction with fire. There's frequently times where we will, not frequently, but we have high hopes and have practiced on a few occasions, times where we have gone through and done prescribed fire or grazing in, say, a brush field that we wish to return to a grassland or grassland mosaic. And the two in conjunction kind of do a double hit on the shrub structure to more effectively reduce the shrub coverage and increase the grassland coverage. So those two are often used in conjunction, and overall, again, compared to mechanical and manual treatments for vegetation management are generally lower impact, certainly lower cost, still not free. All of this takes funding and all of this takes permitting, but if it all lines up, it's a great way to maintain these landscapes. All right. I don't know how I'm doing on time here. Zoe or Joe, how are we doing?
You're good to keep going.
Okay, cool. Am I going too fast? Great,
No,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, so that'll bring me to my last slide then. I won't yeah, try and drag some of this information out because I can talk for a while about all of this. But conclusions, yeah, reducing fire risk, increasing park resilience, and improving habitat quality can be achieved using the full gamut of tools available to you. Whatever you can get permitting for and funding and your funders support, it should be utilized. It needs to be done by a skilled team who knows how to write a prescription for landscape objectives and set out, a long-term plan to achieve it. But with that, like the fire department here, the park district, it can be used to protect community and mitigate fire risk before fire escalates. That's one of our main commitments out here, is to not eliminate fire. Out here with all these ignitions that I was talking about at the start of this, we cannot eliminate the chance of ignitions. That's just not possible. So we need to instead address the fuels that are at these ignition sources, reduce the risk of those fires and ignitions spreading and causing more serious impacts. And at the same time, increase the resilience and improve the forest health so that when these impacts do occur, whatever size they are, there's greater chance for recovery. And generally, these two things just go hand in hand. With the increase in forest resiliency and forest health, you'll see generally a risk reduction for fire hazard. So through proactive measures and effective fuels management, that's the aim. That's the gold standard. So that's what we're trying to strive for here, and using all the tools is the way to do it. That's it for me.
Cool. Thank you so much, Givonne. We're going to pass it off to Allison now to continue the presentation, and afterwards we'll go through the Q&A.
Can you guys see my presentation? Is it, let me see.
Yeah, we can see it.
How's that?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Hi, all. I'm Allison Rofe. I am the rangeland specialist for the East Bay Regional Park District in the Stewardship Department. And here's just a map of the Park District lands, which are both in green and in orange. And the orange polygons identify which parks we use livestock grazing. So I guess just to separate the two kind of grazing programs we have, like Givonne had mentioned, that there's a goat grazing, sheep grazing in the fire department. So we would call that contracted grazing, where the goats and the sheep are and the operators are paid for their services. It's very specific. They're there. Their job is to reduce brush and fuels in the treated areas and maybe adjacent to treated areas. And I think that that's about 1,000 acres and growing. That program, I think it was at 500 acres now. There's about 1,000 acres grazed in the park district with contracted grazing. But the livestock grazing program has been around since the 1960s. It started with Sinol. I mean, historically, there's been livestock grazing in the Bay Area and in California. But for the park district, that was our first park. And currently, we have over 35 parks which is about 87,000 acres that have active livestock grazing. And it's actually a very large program that we have 50 different grazing tenants we work with, and over 70 licenses. And we lease the park lands to the grazing operators so they can conduct their operations. And the type of operations they have, it's common when you go in the park, you might see cow-calf operations. That's probably the most common. And what that means is that we have the mama cows on the landscape essentially year round. So if you go to Wildcat, those cows are like Wildcat cows. They probably live there up to 10 to 14 years. And they produce one baby a year. And that's the operation. And so we're managing how much grass there is on the landscape. There's other objectives that I'll get into. The other common type of operation is a stalker operation, which is more seasonal. So these are like the teenagers that are weaned from their mamas, but they get to kind of live on the parks for more time before they're moved off the parks, either to pasture or to a feedlot. And then we also have some sheep as well. It's much smaller acreage, but we do have some sheep, and that also is not affiliated with a contracted operator. These are ewes that produce lambs. So our operation is very supportive of more of an agricultural kind of community and output versus the contracted grazing, which is those goats and sheep, their job is to eat the brush and the fuels. And we call our program, actually it's livestock grazing, but we call it conservation grazing. And that's because we use cattle. I will say it is our number one tool in the park district for reducing fine fuels. That means those grassy fuels. Like this year, it's a high grass year. You're out there, you're driving, you see that wild oats. It's about 5 feet tall, right? So this year is a very prolific grass year. So that's what we refer to as those fine fuels, those golden stands of grass on the hillsides. But we use grazing to promote biodiversity and conservation outcomes, because grazing does enhance the wildflowers, and it does create essential habitat for our local listed species, especially our amphibian species, like the California red-legged frog and the California tiger salamander, as well as reptiles like the Alameda whip snake, but also grassland birds, burrowing owls, coyotes, birds of prey. It's a novel ecosystem. These are non-native grasses. They were introduced with the missions, and then as it just expanded over California with the ranchos. And they do compete, or they have competed, now they're pretty much naturalized with the native vegetation. And so grazing is a great way to balance that competition, to allow those native plants and to compete for moisture and sunlight. And so that is a different approach. It's an ecosystem management approach, which is different than maybe a traditional livestock operation that would just focus on maybe how much grass there is, right? We're looking at it a little differently. And with that, we also just have some recreational sensitivity when it comes to grazing for us, because we're a public agency that has a lot of recreational opportunities. So here are our goals. So our number one goals, like I said, are reducing fine fuel loads. And we'll say it is the number one tool that we use in the park district. And that's because it's almost passive, right? In a way, like you have these cows out in the landscape and they're eating the grass, and it doesn't require mowing, and it doesn't require a manual labor. So it's I don't know what we would do without the cows, honestly. How we would manage our lands, because we wouldn't be able to get ahead of it. It's just too much acreage. So, and what that does is it maintains our grassland communities. If you Some examples of grassland conversion would be, say, Tilden, where we remove grazing, and when we remove grazing, that actually increases our shrub components, even our native shrub components, which is our native coyote brush. So in the absence of fire, in the absence of grazing, maybe even extreme events, potentially, some of these grasslands without those inputs could easily transition from a grassland to a shrubland, which we see in Anthony Chabot, which we've seen in Tilden, which we've seen in other parks. It even happens at Wildcat, where we have active year-round grazing, but sometimes there's just not enough grazing pressure to reduce that coyote brush. And coyote brush obviously has a lot more fuel than a grass. So that's also one of the reasons we use grazing is to maintain these grasslands communities and to manage invasive weedy vegetation. If you do compare grazed and ungrazed areas, you do see an increase in invasives or non-desirables, especially thistles. And again, just it supports our wildlife habitats. And we do have standards. That's what the residual dry matter is. It's just how much vegetation we leave at the end of the growing season. And we do that so there's enough kind of like mulch, essentially it's like litter that we leave on the ground. So when the rains come, more grass grows. But what's interesting about that RDM is there was a study, and I should have put the paper in the slide, that if so that the district standard is 1,000 pounds of RDM on all slopes, unless we have a specific conservation easement or a specific grazing management plan that says otherwise. But that's pretty much standard across all of our lands, is 1,000 pounds per acre. And we take those measurements in end of August and September. And there was a paper that came out by Roxanne Foss and Felix Ratcliffe, and I think Matthew Shapiro, and they did testing that if you have residual dry matter that's under 1,500 pounds per acre, that means that you'll have it will reduce the flame length to 4 feet. And if you reduce the flame lengths by 4 feet, that means you don't need aerial combat of that fire, that you can have folks on the ground. So I think that's also another benefit of grazing is it creates an atmosphere where if there was a fire and it gets into the grasslands, it's a great place to do a backfire. It's a great place to maybe get on a road and have some on-ground control and reduce the spread of maybe a potential larger wildfire, which we experienced in 2020 when we had the lightning complex fires and Morgan Territory had burned, and same with Ohlone. And they were able to actually stop those fires in the grassland areas of those parks. And I think even that Ohlone fire burned for weeks until it reached that point, with a lot of destruction, along the way. And again, here's just a couple of slides that kind of paint a picture. A lot of our parks are situated in the WUI area. They abut densely populated neighborhoods, sometimes very, very expensive homes, depending on where you are. And so it's essential to continue this type of land use activity so we can continue to provide public safety at a grand scale within both Alameda and Contra Costa County around our regional parks. And I think that's all that I have. And I'm interested to see what kind of questions come up for our folks.